Hey, it's David. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at my entire locomotive collection. I've been collecting model trains for nearly 13 years, and in that time I've gained a number of O-scale, HO, S-gauge, and G-scale locomotives. So I'm going to take you through my entire collection, starting with my first locomotive, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. But one last thing before we get into that, I'd just like to personally thank all of my subscribers on YouTube, as this channel just hit 1,000 subscribers. It's something that I just never really thought would happen. I really can't believe that there's that many people out there that really do want to watch these videos. It really is amazing. You know, it's not the biggest number. There's people out there with millions of subscribers, but to me it really means something. I've always kind of aspired to do something along the lines of making videos and having people enjoy them, so to see that really happen is quite an amazing thing. So I just wanted to say thank you to all those people. This is my first locomotive. This is a Lionel 6-8302 Southern 240 locomotive made around 1970 to 1973. I got this engine as part of a set back when I was 5 years old for Christmas, and I was already obsessed with Lionel trains. My grandpa had some, and so when I got my own set of Lionel, I was more than excited. So I've always cherished this set because it was my first one. Looking back, it's not an impressive set by any means. It's just an NPC era starter set, but for being my first, it really holds a special place in my heart. Now, as you can see, it doesn't work perfectly all the time. The E-unit's having some sort of issue because it only wants to run backwards, so that's why it came into frame backwards, but it's still a very special engine to me. This is my Lionel Santa Fe number 218 locomotive, and it was my first post-war locomotive that I ever got. This was a gift from my great uncle, and it was actually left in his basement from the previous owners, I believe, so we kind of just found it there. So that worked out pretty nice for me. It's also the only O-scale locomotive I have that has that iconic Santa Fe war bonnet scheme, which is probably something I need to work on in the future. But anyways, it's a pretty nice locomotive. Now, it's not in the greatest condition by any means. The battery on the inside was left, and so that corroded like it did in many of these engines, and as you can see, it's a little bit damaged, and is currently not in operating condition. But overall, it's a pretty nice locomotive for what it is, and I still enjoy running it from time to time. This is my Lionel New Jersey Transit GP40. This locomotive came as part of a ready-to-run set which I got for Christmas in 2013. And although I was already hooked on Lionel with the first set I got, this one made sure I wasn't going to go anywhere. This was my first modern set. It came out the year I got it, and I remember just being blown away with the rail sounds, and although it's just ready-to-run locomotive, the detail and everything, it really felt like a real train to me. So I remember using the locomotive all day and running the set all day, and then at night I'd watch the small video that came with the set itself, just dreaming of having a layout one day and all the different products it showed. So this engine too really unlocks a lot of memories for me of being little, but like I said, it was really the first modern train that I got, and so it really kind of opened that world to me. This is a Lionel New York Yankees Berkshire locomotive, which I got as a part of my first passenger set in 2014. This is something I really don't run as much as I should probably. It's a really neat looking locomotive, great color scheme, and I love Berkshires. They're my favorite type of engines. It's just something that has kind of fallen to the wayside because it's not particularly realistic or feature rich. So it's just something I don't really run as much, but I probably should because, like I said, it's a beautiful locomotive. These are a set of Lionel number 205 Missouri Pacific Alco locomotives made about 1957, and these belong to my grandfather. They were actually some of the first Lionel trains that I ever saw, as one day when I was pretty young, he ushered me down to the basement, and he opened a big box of his old trains, and that's really what got me hooked on the O-gauge side of the hobby. And so I've always really loved these engines for that reason. He always told me one day he'd like to give them to me when I was older, and so when I was old enough, he did give them to me along with his other trains, and so I've always cherished them for that reason. This is a Lionel number 244 locomotive made about 1960 or so, and this was another engine that belonged to my grandfather, and was the first engine that I ever saw run. I have a very distinct memory of us setting up a loop of track, I believe on the kitchen island, and running this engine around, and I watched the smoke flow out of the engine, and that's another reason that I really got into this hobby and into the Lionels, because of that moment right there. So this engine's always been very special to me. It's not in perfect condition. It does run, but I chose not to run it for this segment just because if it ran over that switch, it would stop working because it's only got one pickup roller. So again, it's not perfect condition, but for that reason, it's one of the more cherished locomotives in my collection. Now this next locomotive is really less of a locomotive and more of a collection of parts, as you can see. But again, this one belonged to my grandfather, and that's really saving it from ending up in a parts bin. for that reason. I've always thought the orange stripe in the Pennsylvania on the tender was pretty interesting and unique about this engine. Plus, it was the first thing you saw when you opened up the 1958 Lionel catalog, which my grandfather had a copy of, and I spent many hours looking through. This is my Lionel Chief New York Central 080 locomotive. And this was my first Lion Chief locomotive and also my first modern steam locomotive. This engine has remained one of my favorites because it's got all sorts of great detail with the completely fleshed out valve gear and just overall scale proportions, so it's still something I run very regularly. This is a Lion Chief Norfolk Southern GP38-2 painted in the Norfolk Southern First Responders paint scheme. And this engine probably has one of my favorite paint schemes in my collection. It's absolutely amazing, not just with all those awesome colors, but also all sorts of signage and various decals that make it look very realistic. This is my Lionel 2025 locomotive made in about 1947. This engine was kind of my first big post-war steam engine. It wasn't a Scout type, and it was all die-cast. And it's remained, again, one of my favorites in my collection. It's been the subject of numerous videos that I've made, and I love running this one. It's really my go-to when I need to pull some 1940s-era post-war cars. So really, it's just one of my favorite locomotives of all time. This is my Lion Chief Southern Pacific 080 locomotive, and although it's not as detailed as the New York Central 080 I have, the paint scheme on this is absolutely beautiful. It's hard not to love that daylight paint scheme, and I also really like the whistle on this engine. Again, it's not nearly as detailed as the other 080 I have, but it also gets a lot of runtime, actually mostly pulling passenger trains, again, because of that really beautiful daylight scheme. This is a Lion Chief Norfolk Southern ET44 C4 locomotive. This engine is actually one of the few locomotives in my collection I've never really been able to run. I've talked extensively about the issues I've had with this model in the past, but I'm looking to hopefully get it fixed at some point. It's a pretty nice looking model. It hasn't been a primary focus of mine because it's kind of strange. It's a nice locomotive, but it's not fully scale, and it's something where I think I'd rather just focus on acquiring new locomotives in rolling stock instead of repairing this one. But one of these days I'd like to get around to it. This is my Lionel 736 Berkshire. I got this locomotive for Christmas in 2020, and this is my favorite Lionel locomotive of all time. There's just something about the 736, I've always loved Berkshires, they've always been my favorite, and this one to me is just like kind of the pinnacle of post-war steam. I've always loved it. It just looks good pulling anything you put behind it, so this is really one of my go-to engines when I want to run something. Again, it's my favorite in my collection for a reason. This is my Lionel 2046 Hudson from 1953. This engine was the first engine that I ever actually purchased with my own money. I got it the first time I ever went to the Great Train Extravaganza train show in Albany, New York. It was the only thing I picked up at that show, but I got a great deal on it, and it's just one of those classic Lionel steamers that no post-war collection would be complete without, and like I said, it was the first one that I ever bought with my own money. This is a Lionel U.S. Army No. 41 gas turbine switcher locomotive made about 1955. There's something I've always really liked about these small little switcher locomotives. They don't really pull a lot, but they're just really fun to run. I got this engine at the Great Train Extravaganza show in 2022. These are a set of Lionel Canadian Pacific F3 locomotives from 1973. I got these engines as part of the 1973 service station set, and these were my first MPC diesel locomotives and also my only set of Lionel F3s. And these are some of my favorite engines in my collection. That Canadian Pacific paint scheme is just absolutely beautiful. One of my favorite engines, and they look good pulling basically anything. This is my Lionel Ontario Northland SD18 locomotive. This is another MPC diesel locomotive, and I got it at the Rails Along the Mohawk train show in 2022. Another engine with an absolutely beautiful paint scheme. A lot of people criticize MPC era locomotives, but it's hard to deny that their paint schemes were really beautiful. This engine is also one of my favorite train show buys of all time. I got this engine in the box for just $70. This is my Lionel Legacy Santa Fe SD40T-2. I got this engine in June of 2023, and it was the first Lionel Legacy engine that I added to my collection, and actually so far the only Lionel Legacy engine I have in my collection. This engine was a big purchase for me, but I do not regret it at all. I mean, everything about it, from the scale proportions to the amazing detail to the great sound set and all that comes with the Legacy engines, it really was worth it to me. I really love this engine. It's become one of my favorites for certain, and it's, like I said, whenever I need to pull any scale rolling stock or really just want to run an engine that's packed with features and has a relatively modern vibe, this is what I go for. And of course, you gotta love that Santa Fe freight scheme. This is my Lionel 75th anniversary U-boat. I got this engine in June of 2023, and it was kind of an impulse buy for me. The engine was listed almost new in box for just under $30, so I saw that, I made sure the listing was legit, and then I pretty much bought it instantly, so it didn't really matter what was on the locomotive itself. For that price, you can't really pass it up. It's a pretty neat locomotive, pretty kind of a landmark in Lionel's history for being the special engine they released for the 75th anniversary. It was originally part of a whole set. I do not have that set, but we'll probably at some point track down all the cars. This is my Lionel Seaboard SD9. I got this locomotive for Christmas in 2023 as part of Lionel's Mid-Atlantic Limited train set. I'm a really big fan of that Seaboard paint scheme. It just looks great on this engine. This engine just has this very industrial vibe. It just looks like it was made to pull heavy freight trains. This is a Lionel 681 turbine. I got this engine at the Rails Along the Mohawk show in 2024, and I had wanted a turbine for a while, and so I found one there that I was happy with price-wise. Needed a little work, but it runs pretty good now. The turbine's one of those engines that's like no postwar collection is really complete without. Any Lionel collector's got to have at least one turbine. Again, one of Lionel's most iconic locomotives and super fun to run in some contemporary rolling stock. This is my Lionel 8206 New York Central Hudson. This engine represents what was kind of a holy grail item for me. That was the 1972 service station set, which this engine was included in. That's something that I was really interested in finding, and something that was also super rare. So when I found one last October, I was really, really excited. So that's kind of why I like this engine so much. The engine itself isn't that hard to find because everything in that set was sold separately. But I really love the engine because it represents that to me, that set just being such a hard thing to find and being able to finally add one to my collection. This engine is also the only engine in my collection to include that really strange sound of steam feature, which you heard a moment ago. This is my Lionel Chief 675 Prairie locomotive. I got this locomotive for Christmas in 2024. When I first saw the engine cataloged by Lionel, I knew I had to have it. Like I said earlier, the original postwar 2025 is one of my favorite Lionel engines of all time, so seeing Lionel reintroduce the locomotive completely tooled from the ground up was really amazing, and I just knew that I needed to add it to my collection. This engine, like the original that it was based on, has become one of my favorites. I really love the way they took the original postwar locomotive, but added some modern charm like sound effects and various other features. And now we've come to my newest acquisition. This is a Lionel number 218 locomotive. I picked this up at a train show at the Polish Community Center in Albany just 2 weeks ago. But what's special about this is this engine was actually gifted to me by someone at the show. If you want to hear a little more about that, you should check out my most recent video before this one. Even though this engine represents kind of a low to mid-range offering by Lionel at the time, I've always been really interested in these engines ever since I started looking through my grandpa's old Lionel catalogs. You see lots of these style of engines, particularly these number 2018s. So I've had a lot of fun running it around my layout with some late 50s postwar rolling stock. It kind of fits right into that vibe. So that was all my O-scale locomotives, but let's take a look at some of my HO, S-gauge, and D-scale locomotives. Starting with my HO locomotives, I believe this to be a Varney F7. This engine was given to me a few years ago along with some rolling stock and track. It's a pretty neat locomotive, probably from the late 60s or early 70s. It's got a lot of weight to it, and it's a pretty decent runner. This next engine is a Bachman F7, and this represents probably the most common model train in existence, but I still think it's pretty neat. It's got that very shiny chrome-plated silver on it, so it's a pretty neat looking piece for that. It doesn't really run right now. I got to do some resoldering on it. I just haven't gotten around to it because Frankly, it's not the most interesting piece, but still a pretty neat thing to have in my collection. Next, we have these Hawthorne Village F7s painted up in a New York Giants scheme, which Hawthorne Village is basically just Bachman, I think. I got this set from a neighbor, and really I just got it for the track and the transformer, but these engines aren't too bad either. They are probably the nicest HO diesels I have. They've got, modern can motors with flywheels, so they run a bit nicer, and they've got knuckle couplers. The paint scheme's not the most realistic, but they're still fairly nice. And the last HO engine I have is this lifelike Santa Fe 040 steam locomotive. I got this engine for really cheap on eBay not too long ago, and I really got it just for the chassis because I want to eventually modify this into a GN15 locomotive, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a G-scale locomotive meant to represent an engine running on 15-inch gauge track. So hopefully it'll come out being fairly unique. Next, we have my only S-gauge locomotive. This is an American Flyer Royal Blue Pacific from the late 1940s. This was another one of my grandpa's trains. He had a complete American Flyer set, and I've always found it kind of interesting because he had a bunch of postwar Lionel from the late 50s, early 60s, and then he had one American Flyer set from the late 40s. He said he believes it might have belonged to his brother, but it's something I've always kind of wondered about. Now, this engine is definitely not in the greatest condition, especially not in the tender, but I've always thought it was really neat, and again, I cherish it because it was my grandfather's. Now, I have one last locomotive in my collection, but I do not actually have it with me. It's a G-scale Bachman 460 and an RGS paint scheme number 25. But that set is actually at my dad's right now, so I'll just have to include a picture of it above. Alright, so that brings it to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at my collection. And once again, I'd like to give a big thank you to my subscribers. Again, it's pretty amazing to me to see me reach this milestone. I didn't think it would happen, so I'm very excited about that. And I'm excited to continue making videos. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a like and maybe leave a comment below. And if you want to see more stuff like this, subscribe to my channel. Thanks.